Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a panel for you to underline the seriousnesses of this panel and to differentiate it from the Have I Got Cyber quiz for you that I think you saw me in earlier, or you might be seeing me in later. I've worn my glasses just to denote that this is actually a very serious intellectual panel. The panel, I'm reliably informed, is called Machine Learning versus Artificial Intelligence, Cutting Through the Crap. I like to think of it as the panel that's named after the Clash's worst ever album. Joining me on this panel, we have Tash Norris, Head of Security at Moonpig. Say hi, Tash.
Hi, Tash.
Martin Borrett, IBM Distinguished Engineer and CTO at IBM Security EMEA.
Hello, everyone.
We have Javad Malik, Security Awareness Advocate, and I'm reliably informed it's pronounced at NoB4.
It is indeed. Hello.
And Paul Vlisidis, who is Technical Director at NCC Group.
Hey, everyone.
So my first question, I think like a level setting thing, that we can go in all kinds of directions with machine learning, with AI. What is, in a professional capacity, or maybe even in a personal capacity, because that could be very interesting as well, what has been your exposure to AI, ML in a cybersecurity context or in a personal context thus far? Let's start with, well, let's do it in the order I introduced you. Tash.
Cool. So I guess my very first intro was probably the same as many, Dark Trace sales team, pushing forward that AI ML talk. I think in short, though, like a lot of security vendors have really pushed it. And I'm not naming any vendors here, but my experience has been there's a big difference between a lot of if-else statements versus actual machine learning or even just AI. The bit that I'm still, I guess, cutting through the crap of is who's actually doing some really interesting stuff with structured data sets where they can handle incomplete data or brand new data and still give you really tangible outputs versus who just has some really great rules and if-else statements.
And how do you tell the difference, I guess, right? How do you dig through it and actually find out that truth? Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, so great question. I mean, I think there's three areas for me where I personally engaged with it. You know, one is around development of algorithms, computational algorithms. That I think where it gets a bit more interesting though is the second, which is modeling and using machine learning and AI techniques to develop models, test those models, develop new models, and improve the way things work. And I think the most fascinating, maybe it's embryonic, although you can do really meaningful things today, is, you know, if you think about natural language processing and the ability for AI to ingest unstructured information. So I mean written information, right? So there's lots of reports about cyber attacks with lots of good stuff in there, very credible. It's awfully hard for people to read them all, right, and make sense of them and get the insight. So when you start ingesting that stuff and you see the AI making sense of it and then actually making a proposal, you know, in readable natural language, that for me is when the lights start to go on. You start thinking, this is actually quite clever.
What's been your exposure at NCC to that?
So,
I'm breaking my order of introductions now.
I was going to say we cut Javad out there, but so I first sort of started to come across it in a kind of research capacity because we were looking at stuff like I'm coming at it more from the threat side really. So what the baddies can use it for, and we were looking at stuff like phishing. And things like spear phishing, and then we looked at stuff like actually IBM Watson and doing a kind of personality profiling exercise on Watson, which my colleague Matt Lewis, who's our research director, put himself through that, and it came up with all sorts of suggestions, you know, for the kinds of things he liked, the kinds of things he didn't like, and it was sort of already giving us clues as to if we wanted to do some kind of phishing attack, you know, maybe we could use that. Now, and that was a couple of years ago. And then so I sort of got interested in it from a sort of threat perspective, you know, what could bad people do with this? And then of course things like deepfakes started to come along, and some of the kind of I've actually had a few clients now be on the receiving end of things like voice mails that are purported to come from their CEO, which they said, I didn't hear them myself, but he said they were really very convincing. Someone had actually sampled the CEO's voice and then used, an AI type, algorithm to produce, something like Lyrebird or one of those to actually produce a clone essentially of the CEO's voice, but saying something else. And then I started to look into all of that, and it's fascinated me. And then actually my mind was completely blown recently with this GPT-3 text production thing. That Guardian article sent kind of cold chills down my spine, because if you've not read it, it's called "A Robot Wrote This Article. Are You Scared Yet?" And it's absolutely amazing. I mean,
and there have been some fantastic use cases as well for the GPT-3 stuff. I mean, things that that it takes not only technical skill and great engineering skill to do, but also great creativity and imagination. So projects like you can go have a conversation with Plato and get Plato's opinion on stuff, where he's basically regenerating the character of a long dead Greek philosopher. Javed, you have had a portfolio of careers over the last few years. You're a reformed analyst, you were at Alien Vault, and now you're at KnowBe4. So you must have come across the truth and the hype in many different capacities, in many different ways. So what's been your experience through the last few years with machine learning in cyber?
Yeah, so in cyber, I think the first exposure was when I was at 451 Research as an analyst, and I had all these vendors coming and saying, hey, look at our product, it's now powered by pixie dust and magic. And I was like, well, please explain. And to Tash's point, a lot of it's very well embedded, if this and that statements nested to infinitum. And some of them are, I mean, if you strip away the words, some of them are just very good engineering. They understand a very defined parameter when there's very limited sort of variables. You can automate stuff, and it's a good product. But it is very, very early in its stages. There isn't any true implementations, and the ones that are there are, they do produce some shocking results sometimes, like this is a tree, and when it's clearly not a tree, that kind of thing crops up a lot, and that kind of concerns me as well, because I think that in the realm of creatives, and we like to fantasize about where it could take us, we often are led by that, and we don't always consider the consequences. And the one thing I always think about is my travels to the other side of the pond when I go to America. When you're this complexion, this kind of facial hair, and this kind of name, you tend to get stopped and asked a few more questions. And artificial intelligence, is that better or worse than dealing with an American border patrol agent? I don't know, but I'm not saying that they're artificially intelligent. But I do think that there's when you deal with a human on these certain things, there's always room for negotiation or some sort of like appeal or clarifying issues, which unless you're very careful in how you implement it in AI or some sort of like, decision tree, you could lead to a lot of poor decisions. And I fear that we're probably going to hit that first in security before we actually get to some of the better use cases.
You're totally right. I think and it's an accepted term around AI and even machine learning, the small subset of AI that machine learning represents, is that inexplicability is basically a feature of AI. You're not necessarily going to be able to explain why any given learning is reaching the conclusions that it reaches, certainly not without a significant amount of trawling through the decisions and trying to work it out. And it makes it much more difficult to identify wrong decisions. I remember reading about an algorithm that was being tested for self-driving vehicles. And it was the algorithm was to identify where there was road and where there wasn't road, and they couldn't work out why it wasn't working out properly, because it was doing very well, and then it would make these what looked like really elementary mistakes. And it turned out through a significant amount of research and time that the way that it was working out whether something was a road or not was actually whether or not it had a grass verge, and it wasn't looking at any other factors. So as soon as the grass verge disappears, you're not on a road anymore, and obviously that can lead to all kinds of vehicular shenanigans. So yeah, you're right. That lack of explicability is huge. And I think, and this is something I know, Javad, because I don't want to steal your thunder, you mentioned in email exchanges that we had prior to this recording, the other not very transparent and extremely hidden part of AI is the ethical approach, right? Do you want to go into that a little bit? Maybe we can all talk around the ethics that are buried or not buried in AI.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's people that are coding it. They might be smart people, but the seed is laid by a group of people. And if they're all very similar people living in the same part of the world with shared experiences, they're going to be very good at validating each other's, like, yes, that's correct, that's correct. And when you put that out to the rest of the world, where they don't have grass verges on the side of the road, for example, that's going to cause issues. So, I think the problem is that as we've become more reliant on these technologies and the computer says no thing becomes a real thing, any small deviations, any small mistakes can have potentially massive consequences. And I think that's something that working in cybersecurity or in a small field, we don't fully appreciate all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. If it strikes me at not wanting to belittle the concerns of the human concerns, let's say, around machine learning and AI. If we take your example but restrict it just to the cyber domain, I think it's fair enough to say that actually Tash is probably the only real practitioner in the room, right? I think the technical director, CTO EMEA, and security awareness advocate and me probably do a lot less practitioning in real life than Tash does. So I'd be really interested to hear from someone at the coalface. Do you feel that machine learning has brought anything to your cyber situational awareness, capability, visibility, has added anything concrete to your security life yet? Do you expect it to, if it hasn't?
Great question. So I guess kind of first off, there's this real balance, right, between how quickly you adopt AI in a world where there are errors or possible biases. And I think in a world where our threat landscape is growing really fast, sometimes we're pushed into adopting tools faster than we can effectively test them. I think WAF and EDR tools are great examples of this, where they come with ML or AI capabilities or a subset of AI ML. And you roll it out quickly, right, to see if you can get value. And for some of these vendors, we're certainly seeing that. At Moonpig, we've seen a great level of value delivered from EDR and WAF tools. I'm still on the fence as to whether that's just really good if-else statements. But there's a long way to go. I think my worry is there's two parts to it. One is when it comes to adopting AI quickly before you have a chance to test, is whether the errors that I get back from it are any more than the errors I would get through human error. You talked about self-driving cars earlier and about how some of them still crash because they can't tell where the edge of the road is. But is that still less crashes than I would have had should I have been driving? And so is that a risk that I'm willing to take? And then secondly, whether there is where those errors occur, am I hurting our conversion rate, right, for our customers? Am I devaluing my product in any way? Mm-hmm. That being said, I'm all for it. I think the biggest use case for me at the moment is going to be getting rid of some of those really trivial alerts from a security detection and response perspective. There's nothing I think we could do better that would help with retention for security analysts across industry in general than getting rid of some of those level 1 alerts by being able to use really good models to contextualize and respond to those for us.
So let's maybe hear an IBM perspective on that, because obviously IBM have been one of the historically most vocal leaders in developing AI, public-facing AI machine learning anyway, let's put it that way, with things like Watson, right? So based on what Tash has just said, what would you say would be, if not the IBM view, maybe you're not allowed to, certainly the Martin view?
I'm not sure I can speak for the whole company.
And do it.
But,
no one's
but I certainly share a perspective. I mean, I think Tash is absolutely right. I mean, a lot of this does depend on the data set, the training. I mean, that's fundamental. You know, you have self-learning, you have assisted learning, and that whole process and the data you're relying on, you know, that old adage of rubbish in, rubbish out. So you do have to be very careful about how you train those models. And I think our view, and, you know, we're not alone in the industry, you know, there are others, you know, who are signing up to agreements around AI ethics, right? But it is super important when we're not there yet that we are transparent about how this stuff actually works.
Yeah.
You know, and we've got to be inclusive. I think it is important, like other schemes, that we expose it to scrutiny and validation. And, you know, reliability and all these qualities, I totally agree. They're really important. And I guess the reality is that we are in the infancy and we don't fully understand the harm side of what might happen. I'm always very much about the positives, right? What it can do for us, how it can make my life better, how I can spot attack faster, right? How I can enhance data classification, how I can do something cleverer that makes my life more straightforward, so I can kind of move up the value chain. And that's what I think we're generally trying to do. But we do have to be cautious, and we do have to be transparent, and we do have to work as an industry. I think that's my perspective.
Okay. So this has led us down an avenue of conversation which could go on for a very long time, but I have a timer running down here, and I'm very conscious that we're really up against it right now. So I was going to ask you to, as a parting question, this literally has been inspired by the last few minutes of conversation. What's, as your final thoughts, what's your 5 years from now? What's your AI worst nightmare, and what's your AI paradise?
I guess for me, one of the just to sort of carry on from the theme we were on before, the AI nightmare could be that a lot of the security awareness training and stuff that we provide now, and this is probably more a point for Javad, but a lot of that stuff relies on you know, being able to spot the fact that it is a little bit off, there's something a little bit not right about it. You can mouse over something and look at the domain name, you can do all those wonderful things, and it's getting harder because you know, they're getting better. And I can imagine a scenario in 5 years' time where absolutely none of that applies. You know, we could end up having a text conversation on our phone with a piece of malware, or we could end up having a social media chat with a fake friend on Facebook that's been generated by an AI. We're never going to have a clue. So our level of trustworthiness in the world is going to fall even further as a cybersecurity professional than it already is, which is pretty low. So that's a kind of scary thought, really. In fact, you just can't trust anything anymore.
And what's the most
we're there now?
What's your AI paradise? What do you want it to be doing for you 5 years from now?
The AI paradise, and I've seen some evidence of this, is where you've got something, and it might even be your phone assistant that basically spots these things for you and says, yeah, don't answer that message, it's definitely been generated by an AI, or even doesn't even let you see the message in the first place, although that's a little bit dangerous. But you know what I mean? That will be the AI paradise, where the tools are actually working for me and not against me.
Yeah.
Go on, Javid.
I'll go on, Tash. Go on.
I was just going to say my nightmare is that the bias of a few becomes the bias of many.
Yeah.
So in a world where so few talented individuals might be working on these data sets and training these models, they ultimately could be adopted by a lot of us. I think it's very easy for, whether it's a conscious or unconscious bias of a few, to become the unconscious bias of all of us, because our choices are narrowed, right, without us even realizing they're being narrowed. And so I worry about the innovations that don't occur because we are naturally directed away from them without even realizing. And the problems that you encounter and the solutions you build for those problems are problems that have already been defined by something else. And so you no longer are in a world where you can come up with elegant solutions to problems that don't exist yet, because you're not allowed to see what those problems could be.
Yeah.
And then I guess on the other side, the dream for me is that we, and this is a bit of a weird, it's very cybersecurity dream. There's enough, I guess, enough governance around this that allows us to use AI in a way where it does remove a lot of those tedious tasks and those tasks that stop us from being able to unleash that creativity. And so we're able to spend our time more on those unusual attack vectors and come up with the kind of more innovative paths. But I think to do that, you need the right level of governance to make sure that the bias of few doesn't become the bias of the many.
Yeah, you're basically talking about two sides of the same coin there, aren't you? Either it, to quote the world famous living in a box, either we're living in a box or it enables us to think outside the box, right? Excellent. That's the bias of the few becoming the bias of the many is probably something that's more scary than I had given it.
That's the most quotable thing from this entire conversation.
Well done. Javed, what were you going to say?
So yeah, my sort of like utopia paradise is kind of like a cybersecurity version of Jarvis from Iron Man. It's kind of like where the I think when you look at how we are with architecture as a whole, with cloud, with systems being able to spun up and down, it's basically AI creating a custom environment for anyone and everyone. So you don't have a standard static web app that everyone can access, but it only shows you a certain dimension of it, locks down everything else depending on who you are, risk factors, you're a customer, repeat, this, that, the other. Internally, I think it can, like, you know, take all your emails or take your phone calls and be that barrier, do all the analysis before it, you know, releases stuff, and, you know, that kind of thing. I think it can create a very personalized environment from a security perspective, which can really massively reduce the footprint. You know, maybe even do some cleanup for you as well. So hey, AI, go and, you know, ensure that my footprint isn't bad, or, you know, people can't harvest data from me. So I think that's kind of like where I'd see a utopian sort of future.
We have to hurry. So Martin, you're not there. Damn, that didn't work. You're there in real life.
Yeah, you're over here.
Martin.
Oh
no, I think he's down there for me.
But I think we are onto the scary bit around the whole ethics of what we're doing, and the transparency which we touched on before. You know, really knowing how it works and knowing that you're dealing with AI. I think where it gets scary is when you don't know how it works. You know, you naturally worry about these elements of bias and so on. So I think that's just so important. And I'm kind of with Javed about, you know, I want AI to make my life easier, to cut down on the noise, on the rubbish, the mundane. You know, I want it to help tell me what's important, what I should focus on.
Again, Martin.
Sorry?
You would never see me again, that being the case. I mean, seriously.
I don't think that's true.
It's
actually, it's much worse than that, Martin. You may only see Rick. That's the
Wow.
Everything else might get excluded.
Yeah, that's
the bias, doesn't
the hell.
it?
That's the
Depends on
artificial
bias.
intelligence hell. You have to talk to only me and every aspect of me all at the same time. It's been a fascinating discussion. I honestly wish that we had far more time to discuss it. Thank you, each of you. Oh no, Paul, don't argue with me. Paul.
Hey, that's correct.
Tash, Javed, and Martin. Honestly, it's been great. I think we should do this again, and we should do it again for Cyber House Party, and Cyber House Party long may you continue. Thank you all for joining us in this panel discussion about The Clash's worst ever album. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.